Well, good morning. Last summer, we had an intern that was here. We actually, believe it or not, hired him to come back again this summer, but he was a really great guy. He just didn't have air conditioning in his car, which in Texas in the summer is a problem. And some of you know this guy and you know how lovable he is, but this was his fatal flaw. And we had a lot of people offer to help fix his air conditioning, but he, I guess, was too proud or something and would always say, no, it's okay. But every time he showed up to something, he'd get out of his car just sweating bullets, right? Just looked miserable. No air conditioning in his car. One time he went to visit his girlfriend out in West Texas, and on his way back, his phone overheated. It was so hot in his car. So we had no GPS, but he's like, I'm about 3.5 hours away from the church, so I'm just going to start, I'll follow the highway signs and head my way back to Dallas. And after about 3.5 hours, he thought, man, I have no idea where I am. And so he pulled over, went into a gas station, got some gas, let his phone recover, pulled his GPS back up after it was going again, and it said, you are 5 hours away from Dallas. And he ended up going 3.5 hours in the wrong direction. For me, I thought the welcome to Oklahoma sign would be a dead giveaway, but some people you just don't know. You just can't help them. It's hard to know how to get where you're going when you don't know the way. And sometimes we are sure that we know the way, when in reality, at some point we look up and ask ourselves, where in the world am I going? What am I doing? How did I get here? This week, as we look at John chapter 21, this is the end of John and the end of our For Real series. Jesus takes a little bit of a change of course in his talking to the disciples because he's realized that they, in between his death and now, have ended up heading in a different direction than the direction in which he set them on. Today we're going to look at this story in John 21, and we're going to talk a little bit about calling and what it means to be called by God. If you have a Bible, would you open it with me to John chapter 21? We'll spend all of today just about in John 21, and it will be on the screen if you don't have a Bible. John 21 opens with the disciples. They're gathered together. They're kind of confused, right? Jesus died and then he rose from the dead. And now there's this moment of what do we do with this Jesus who has died and risen from the dead? He really is who he said that he was. So all of his teachings were true. What do we do at this point in our life? And Peter, with the other disciples on the Sea of Galilee, says, hey, let's go fishing. Like a man would. For those of you unfamiliar, Peter was a commercial fisherman before Jesus called him to be a disciple. So he says to the disciples, let's go fishing. And the other disciples say, okay, we'll join you. And so they fish all night. They're hungry and they don't catch anything. And then in the morning, Jesus walks up onto the shore and they don't realize that it is Jesus that is standing there. Let's look at verse 5 in John 21. Verse 5. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. I've been there many times on fishing trips. No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved, that's John, by the way. He calls himself in his own gospel the disciple whom Jesus loved. You sort that out in your own time. The disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off. And this is normal for fishing back in the day. You're not fishing with all your clothes on. You're fishing with as little clothes as possible. And he jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. And when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat, dragged the net ashore, and it was full of large fish, 153. What an odd detail. There's a lot of different theories on this number 153, but one of the most convincing, I think, is that in the Roman world at this time, they believed that 153 was the entire number of all the species of fish. How many different species are there? 153. And as someone that grew up on the water, I can tell you there's a lot more than that. But that's what they thought. There's 153. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. What a miracle. And Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew that it was the Lord. At first glance, this is just a scene of Jesus cooking breakfast for disciples. That's a nice thing to do, but you can tell that Peter is the main focus of this story. He gets a lot of face time, but we haven't seen Peter in John's gospel since John 18. And in John 18, we see Peter standing around a fire outside of the city gate, being questioned on if he's a friend of Jesus, if he knows Jesus. And he says, "No, I'm not that man's friend. I don't know that man." 3 times he denies Jesus. And we haven't really seen him in the narrative since that moment. And here he is again, face to face with Jesus. I don't know if any of you have ever made a decision in your life thinking that you would never have to answer for that decision. I imagine that's what happened with Jesus. It's happened with me one time. For instance, anytime that Anna asks me if the outfit she's wearing looks good, I know that the answer is never no. Okay, that can't be the answer. And how do I know that? Because one time Anna asked me if the outfit she was wearing looked good early in our marriage, and I said no. And now for 5 years, she's been telling people, one time Hunter had the audacity when I asked him if the outfit I was wearing looked good to say no. So I know what it's like to think that, this will never have any consequences, right? Maybe he thought in that moment when he's denying Jesus that, this will not catch up to me. No big deal. And then Jesus was who he said that he was, and he rose from the dead. And Peter is face to face with Jesus again, and he's confronted with this moment. And in this moment, Jesus takes an opportunity to call Peter back to him. This scene in John 21 that we've just read is the exact same scene of Peter's calling. In Luke chapter 5, it's very similar. Peter and Jesus had just met. Jesus gets into Peter's boat, and Jesus is teaching, and everyone's wowed. And then he says, to Peter, who has been up all night, hasn't caught any fish. Sound familiar? He says in Luke chapter 5, "Cast your net over the right side of the boat." And he does, and he catches more fish than he can haul into the boat. And then here's Peter's response in Luke 5. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. And then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore, and they left everything, and then they followed him. In their interaction in John chapter 21, Jesus takes Peter back to this moment of calling, and he's going to call him again. Jesus has not changed, and Jesus' call on Peter's life has not changed, despite Peter having a moment of sin and shortcoming. He has this moment now of shame. The call of the kingdom does not change because of your sinfulness or shortcoming, and that's good news. By replicating the scene of Peter's calling, Jesus here is reminding Peter of what he has called him to do. And I think this morning, Jesus wants to remind a lot of us of what he has called us to do. Because many of us had an encounter with Jesus at some point, but at some place in between there and here, we have gotten off track a little bit. Maybe it's sin, some shortcoming, a point of shame in our life. And Jesus wants to call us back to the way that he has set for us. So before we return to the story, I want to talk a little bit about calling. What is calling? And for starters, just broadly, I believe that God is calling each of us to three things, right? Really three levels of calling, if you've never heard this language before. The first thing, God is calling each of us to personal salvation. And that's true, right? This is that He's calling us to trust in Him for the salvation of sin, the saving from our sin. And this is in the calling world, right? What God has for your life, I mean, by calling. This is the training wheels of everything, right? Imagine a child learning to ride a bike with training wheels. At first, when they get on the bike, even with the training wheels on, it's kind of a terrifying task. It's this new thing. It's a new mechanic. It's a big deal. And you have these training wheels, and you're like, okay, I guess I'm going to ride this bike. But then eventually those training wheels come off. The training wheels of our faith, the very beginning of our calling, is this idea of personal salvation. And some of you are looking at me like, oh, of course He's calling everyone to be personally saved by Him. But for some in this room, you've heard this is you hearing this for the first time. That what Jesus wants first and foremost for you is to be able to have been a sacrifice for your sin. And that is great news. So He's first calling us to personal salvation. Second, He's calling us to kingdom service. So at first there's this moment of, okay, the first calling of Jesus is just me and Jesus. Me and God. My salvation. The second moment of Jesus, the second calling of Jesus here is a calling to be a part of something bigger than myself. To serve a kingdom and a king. And Peter's calling in some way, because Peter was the first head of the church, Peter's calling is generally the calling of all of us in the kingdom. Right? Peter was a fisherman that Jesus said, hey, you're no longer going to fish for creatures of the sea. You're now going to fish for people for the kingdom. And he hauls in 153 fish, one of every kind. This reminds me of Matthew 28, where Jesus says to His disciples before He sends into heaven, hey, go and make disciples of all nations. Go and make disciples of all kinds. And so we all have this call to be a part of the kingdom that is making disciples. That's true of all of us. We are all called to make disciples. And then even further than that, we are all called to something specific. I had a boss in high school, and I remember he would say, quite often I feel like, Hunter, for better or worse, you are unique. The irony is this guy owned a warehouse that just stored Civil War memorabilia and reenactment clothes and stuff. And so I thought, man, you're the unique one here. You're the one doing something wild. We are all unique. There's something specific, special about each of us. And one of the hardest things for some of us is finding what is unique to us in the call of God. Right? He's called all of us to personal salvation. He's called all of us to be a part of this making disciples. But then you specifically have something that God is calling you to do. Calling you to use your personality, your gifts to make disciples. And within the kingdom, we need all sorts of people called in all sorts of directions to make disciples. Not everybody is called to preach. Someone has to manage the money that is given to care for the poor. Somebody has to translate the Bibles that are used across the world. Somebody has to prepare the food for the hungry and the clothes for those that need clothes. Somebody has to live on the west side of town to be the presence of Jesus in that taco shop. What a good calling. Somebody has to live on the east side of town to be the presence of Jesus in that coffee shop. Somebody's got to go up north and minister to our Hispanic brothers and sisters, and somebody has to go a little bit south to minister to our black brothers and sisters. But on Sunday, we come back together, a bunch of people with a specific, unique calling, gathering in one place with a united mission to make disciples. Amen. And it just looks different. And one of the issues with all churches is that they think everybody's specific calling has to be the same. Our church is going to do this one thing. But the uniqueness of the body is that our church, and it's a great church, is different than the church down the street, which is also a great church. Because God's called the individuals that make up this body differently than He's called the individuals that make up the body down the street. we're called to something specific. And so how do we discern, like, what is God calling me specifically to? Well, there's two extremes when you talk about calling, two pitfalls that people tend to fall in. The first is my general temptation, and it's this hectic, busy body temptation. It's the extreme to say, you know what, my calling is actually, I'm confusing my calling with just being busy. As long as I'm really busy, then I'm active in doing what God wants me to do. And these folks can never stop. They can never disengage. They go from event to event, meeting to meeting, thing to thing, purposefully keeping themselves busy without any real why. They're purposefully busy without any real purpose. And they think, oh, that's my calling. And then there's the opposite. There are those that are puttering around in their lives thinking, oh, somebody else will do it. They ignore calling altogether, and they never do anything that they don't have to. They do the bare minimum, always disengaged, and they're apathetic and have lost any desire to discover their why. But there is a middle place to live, and our calling is in this middle place. It's not a hectic busybody, and it's not sitting around just trusting that God's going to get everything done. He wants to use us. And living as you were called to do opens you up to a world of freedom. And there's questions we have to ask when we're discerning our calling. Who am I? Who has God made me to be? What are my passions? What are the things that get me out of bed in the morning? What fills me up? These things are all really important. But at the end of the day, we need to spend time with the Lord about our calling. Because no matter how good you think you know yourself, God knows you better. And often He calls us to something that at first we're like, there's no way. Not me. Why would I be the one that you're asking to do that? But God knows us better than we know us. I had a moment 4 or 5 months ago where I was exhausted. I was worried about my heart. I was like literally my physical heart. And I went to the doctor, and I was talking to the doctor about all this stuff, and she's like, yeah, it sounds like you're really stressed out. Could you tell me about all the things that you do, whatever your week looks like? And so I walked her through a normal week of my life, and she was like, wow, that's way too many things. You are too busy. And I said, no, you don't understand. I love all the things that I do. And she said, you might love the things you do, but your body doesn't. Yeah, that was a big wake-up call for me. I was like, oh, well, what do you do when you love everything that you do, but you can't continue to do all the things that you do? And so you go to the Lord and you say, God, what do you want from me? What does it mean for me to be called to this place at this time of my life? What do you have for me? And I have found freedom and a confidence in what I believe God is calling me to do in this season. And there is freedom that comes in calling. University president and author Gordon T. Smith says that knowing your calling sets you free in 5 ways. Number 1, when you know what you're called to do, you're free from comparing yourselves to others. I realized that I was so busy because I was trying to keep up with what I saw everybody else doing. And I wasn't just doing what God had called me to do. When you know what you're called to do, you don't have to compare yourself to others because God's given them something else that they're called to. God hasn't called you to do what they do. Second, you're free from artificial standards of excellence. Martin Luther King Jr. was asked how he deals with the standards of excellence that other people put on him. And he says he never gives too much into praise or criticism. You are not your worst day, and you are not your best day. God's call on your life is not dependent upon other people's evaluation of how good you're doing at that call. Third, you're free from the burden of pleasing everybody. And we love to make people happy. We love to please everybody. But if you're concerned about pleasing everybody, you will find yourself adjusting your call to fit what other people think that you should be doing. Ultimately, God will help you accomplish your call, but you can't make everybody happy. Jesus sure didn't make everybody happy. And then you are free from the urgency and tyranny of time. Sometimes God gives us a call and we think, oh, I got to get this done today. But often God is a slow working God. He doesn't move at this fast pace. Time is no longer your enemy. It's now your friend. You have time. That's your call. And then finally, you are free to love others. Paul talks a lot about service, like finding your place to serve in the body in calling in Romans chapter 12. And in Romans 12:3, he says, "For by the grace given to me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourselves with sober judgment in accordance with the faith that God has distributed to each of you." Then in Romans 12, he goes on to list a bunch of ways in the body that you can that are of service and things that you can do and different places you could be called. And this all this culminates in verses 9 and 10 of Romans 12. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. And be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Knowing what God has called you to do sets you free to love people in a way that you couldn't do if you're so consumed with all the other questions, if you're so locked into all the other wonderings and worries about what you're supposed to be doing. Sets you free to love in a new way. You can put others before yourself. One of the troubles to calling is that we all want to be called to be top dog. A lot of us want to be called to be something glamorous. But most of us are called to the simple things, the faithful things. Back to John 21. When Jesus reminds Peter of his calling, he's reminding him of who he really is. He's reminding him of what he's supposed to be doing. But there's something in the way of Peter embracing what God is calling him to do. Peter is filled with shame. He's struggling with this. And now he finds himself face to face with Jesus again after he's denied Jesus. And what does Jesus do? Well, if I'm Peter, I'm hoping that Jesus just doesn't acknowledge it. That Jesus just sweeps it under the rug and says, hey, no biggie. Doesn't even mention my denial. Right? Like, at the graduation party yesterday, I know that you saw me eat 7 cookies, but I don't want you to mention it. Let's just pretend like it didn't happen. We don't want our shame to be brought into light. But that's not what Jesus does. Jesus goes straight at the point of shame. And how do we know this? Well, the first thing is when Peter's on the boat, if you remember, he wasn't clothed, and he put on his cloak and before he dove in the water to go back to Jesus. This is reminiscent of Adam and Eve in the garden whenever they're ashamed and God enters back into the garden and they cover themselves with fig leaves. Peter covering himself is a clue to us that there's some shame that's being dealt with. And then second, we see that Jesus has recreated another scene, the charcoal fire. We only see a charcoal fire twice in all of Scripture. In John 18, when Peter denies Jesus, and then in John 21, when they meet again here. And so as Peter is standing around this fire, I bet the smells, the scene, the atmosphere brings him back to this moment of shame for him, this point of denial. And then Jesus asked Peter 3 questions to directly confront the 3 times of denial that Peter has. Let's look at verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Probably a reference to children. Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." And then the 3rd time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was hurt. Peter was hurt here by Jesus because Jesus has gone straight to the shamed point of Peter's life. Peter has an open wound in front of Jesus, and Jesus goes straight at that wound. Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." Then he tells him what his life's going to look like from here on out, his specific call. "Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." And Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, "Follow me." Jesus brings Peter back to the point of shame. But Jesus also meets Peter where he's at. I was thinking about this. This is one of the renderings that is difficult in the English, but Jesus says, "Do you love me?" 3 times, and Peter says, "You know that I love you" 3 times. The first 2 times that Jesus says, "Do you love me?" he's saying, "Do you agape me? Do you love me?" This unconditional, this heavenly kind of love. And Peter responds, "You know that I philo you." Greek's miserable sometimes. And he's saying, "You know that I love you as a friend. You know that I love you as a brother." And then Peter says this all 3 times. Not agape, but philo, right? And then the third time, Jesus meets him where he's at. He says, "Hey, do you philo me? Do you love me like a friend?" This is, I think, a way that Jesus is meeting Peter where he's at in this moment of shame. He says, "Hey, I will. If this is the love that you have right now, that's where we can start." But he's still going at the wound. And why would he do that? Why would Jesus go directly at Peter's wounded spot? Because he is the only one that can heal that wound. And it hurts in the moment when your shame is brought to light, when your shame is addressed, when the darkest parts of you, your sin and your shortcoming, come out in front of Jesus. That hurts. But Jesus is the only one that can heal it. And he took on shame so that we don't have to be ashamed. And sometimes we're hesitant to go to Jesus because we're afraid that he won't turn from us because of our sin, that he'll reject us because of our sin. But it's the opposite, right? He died to forgive the sins of those that would turn to him. But for some reason, in our mind, in our hearts, we've twisted this narrative to say, well, my sin is too much here. This shame is too great here. This moment in my past is too deep, too dark of a moment. Hebrews 12:2 tells us that for the joy that was set before him, he died on the cross for the sins of us. It brings him joy to see you set free from shame. And for some of us, we struggle to be what God is calling us to be because of the shame in our life. Because we can't get past something that is just hanging us up. Do you want to be free is a question that we have to ask ourselves. Do you want to be free to be what God has created you to be who God has created you to be? And I don't know what it is for you. There's so many different points of shame. Some of us are ashamed of our body, our ability to parent, a relationship we had years ago, a relationship we're in now, words that we said earlier. We're ashamed of our lustful behaviors, of our pride, of our anger. Some of us are ashamed of things that we did when we were kids, or things that were done to us when we were kids. And Jesus wants to make those things right and set us free from those things. Every week we have people that are down here that are prepared to pray over the shame that we walk in here with, and the shame of those that we know, the sins of those that we love. They want to pray. We want to be praying about those things, because it's only in the confession of sin, that we can be set free, really set free. It's no coincidence that all the great stories of human civilization are about the exact same thing. Odyssey by Homer, Divine Comedy by Dante, Pilgrim's Progress by Bunyan, even Lord of the Rings, or Star Wars, or the Hunger Games. You name your series, your story of choice, and they're probably all the exact same story, just with a little bit different characters. They're all about a people or a person that's on a journey. The hero or heroine, they leave home, they face many dangers and toils, and they hit some kind of wall. And they either die and are reborn, or they have some epic descent into darkness and then ascent into light. It's the same story again and again. And then they find a moment of salvation, and they sit in this salvation, and then they pass the salvation on, and they go back home. All the stories are functionally the same. They follow this same line. And that's because this story's been told a million times over and over, all different iterations, all through the ages, because it's the story of us. And it's the story of Scripture, the people of God seeking salvation, going through the wilderness, trials and hardships. And then they reach salvation. We are all invited on a journey with Jesus. That's what the Christian faith is about. It's about waking up every day and getting back on the road with Jesus. But some of us, if we're honest, we're worried that this time, after this sin, is going to be the time that we come back to Jesus. And he doesn't say, "Do you love me? Then come and follow me." That he's going to say what we expected him to say to Peter around the fire. Right, that scene sets up, and we expect him around the fire to say, "Do you love me?" And Peter says again, "You know that I love you. Why do you keep asking me?" And we expect Jesus to say, "You don't love me. You blew it. You had your opportunity to prove that you loved me." Some of us, that's what we expect Jesus to say to us when we go to him. But again and again, Jesus says, "Do you love me? Then come and follow me." We're on a journey with Jesus, where every day we wake up and he says, "Do you love me? Then come and follow me." And we get to choose if we're going to get back on the road and follow him every day. Sometimes we're so consumed about what somebody else's calling is. If somebody else is on the road with Jesus. This was a temptation of Peter. After Jesus told Peter he was going to die, Peter looks over at John and he says, "Well, what about him? Is this going to happen to him too? Will he die the same way?" And then Jesus says this to Peter. John 21:22. "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." God's calling you to follow him. And so stop thinking, even in this moment, for yourself. Stop thinking about people other than yourself. Stop thinking about your kids or your parents or your neighbors or your friends. God is calling you to follow him. Some of you, for the 9 millionth time, he's calling you to follow him. Some of you for the first time. And I'll say with confidence, right? This is me casting my net on the right side of the boat kind of moment. I'll say with confidence that you following Jesus, whether for the first time or the 9 millionth time, it's the best decision that you can make. And this morning and tomorrow morning, Jesus is calling you to come and follow him. And you should follow him. Not because you might die tonight. That's a bad reason to have any kind of faith. It doesn't last long. You'll just be drifting away every couple weeks. You should follow him, not because you might die tonight, but because you have to live tomorrow. And the way of Jesus is a better way. And life with Jesus is a better life. For some of you, Jesus wants to call you back today. But there's a shameful part of your life, something that is just a hang-up for you. And I just want to invite you to give that to Jesus. because he is the wounded healer. He's the one that heals all wounds. He's the one that can set you free from comparison and people-pleasing, being consumed by excellence and perfection, sets you free to live like you were made to live. If you would, just close your eyes. I want you to pray with me. We will go back into worship in just a moment, but I just want you to pray with me. I believe God's called each of you to something unique. And I just want you to start the conversation here. God, what are you asking of me in this season of my life? That's the prayer. God, what are you asking of us in this season of our church? God, we want to follow you. God, I pray that you would help us get on the road with you so that we could live our life to the fullest. In Jesus' name, amen.